It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and the city mall was buzzing with people. Families were shopping for weekend deals. Children were laughing in the toy aisles, and workers from nearby offices stopped in for quick errands before heading home. In the middle of all this, one woman walked into a large department store carrying a small handbag and a calm smile. She wasn't in uniform today. She was off duty, dressed in jeans and a plain shirt just like anyone else. She had come to buy a few simple things, some groceries, a pair of gloves for work, and a few household items. It was supposed to be a quiet, ordinary stop. She walked through the aisles, selecting things carefully. She knew this store well. She often stopped here after her shifts, because it stayed open late and had friendly staff. After about 20 minutes, she reached for her phone. It was vibrating again and again, the familiar pattern of calls she usually got when something urgent came up. Out of habit, she stepped aside near a shelf to answer it. Her voice lowered as she spoke, her tone steady and professional. Even though she was off duty, she still responded to department calls when someone needed quick advice or assistance. While she talked, she absent-mindedly placed the few small items she had picked into her tote bag, not to hide them but to free her hands. She thought she'd finish her call, walk to the front counter, and pay for everything. The call took longer than she expected, and by the time she ended it, she was already close to the store's exit. As she turned to head toward the register, a voice called out sharply, "Excuse me, ma'am. Could you stop right there?" She froze, confused. Two store security guards approached her, one of them already speaking into a radio. The shoppers nearby slowed down, curious to see what was happening. "Yes," she said calmly. "Did you pay for those items in your bag?" One guard asked, his tone serious. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Not yet," she replied honestly. "I just took a call. I was about to—" "Please don't move," the guard interrupted, signaling his partner. "We've had issues with theft recently." Within moments, two uniformed police officers who had been patrolling nearby entered the store. They walked straight toward the guards, who pointed her out. To anyone watching, it looked like a normal arrest scene. The officers didn't recognize her. After all, she wasn't wearing her badge or carrying her duty gear. She tried to explain, speaking calmly but firmly. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. I'm actually—" "Ma'am, please keep your hands visible," one of them interrupted, keeping a neutral but cautious expression. "I'm an officer," she said quickly, hoping that would clarify things. "My ID is in my car. I can show you." But the word officer didn't seem to change their tone. Many people claimed to be officers or officials when caught, and these two had heard similar excuses before. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us," one officer said, keeping his voice low. "If everything checks out, you'll be free to go." Her heart sank. She could feel the eyes of dozens of strangers watching her. Mothers whispered to their kids, people whispered to each other. Phones came out, some recording. She wasn't angry yet, just stunned. Everything was happening too fast. "I didn't take anything," she said softly. "Please, I can explain." "We'll sort it out at the station," one of the officers replied. Before she could say anything else, one officer gently guided her toward the door. He wasn't rough, but it still felt humiliating. The guards stood by, arms crossed, convinced they had done the right thing. The store manager arrived too, nodding approvingly at the quick response. As they stepped outside, the afternoon sun hit her face. She looked around, searching for words. She had served in this very district for years. She had helped these same people, the store employees, the security guards, maybe even these officers. But at that moment, none of it mattered. She kept her composure. Her instinct as a trained officer told her not to resist, not to argue. The more she spoke, the more defensive it might seem. So she stayed quiet as they placed her near the patrol car. "Ma'am, do you have any ID on you?" one asked. "In my car," she repeated softly. "There's a badge and my identification inside the glove box. My keys are in my pocket." The officer hesitated for a second but decided to follow procedure. "We'll check that in a bit," he said, gesturing for her to sit in the back seat. She obeyed. The sound of the door shutting echoed loudly in her ears. It wasn't the first time she had been in a patrol car, but never like this, never from the inside as a suspect. Inside the store, the scene was already fading. People returned to their shopping, though a few still whispered about what they'd seen. The store manager told one of the employees to save the security footage just in case. The guards gave each other small nods, proud that they had handled the situation quickly. Meanwhile, The officers radioed the station to report a possible shoplifting suspect being transported for verification. The woman sat quietly in the back seat, looking out the window at the passing streets she knew so well. Every corner, every shop, every sign reminded her of her years on duty. The calls she had answered, the people she had helped. Now she was the one under suspicion. She thought about how it all looked from the outside. A woman caught leaving a store with unpaid items, refusing to stop, saying she was an officer. It sounded suspicious. She understood that. But still, the pain of being misunderstood ran deep. She wondered if anyone from her department would soon hear what had happened. At the station, things moved routinely. Paperwork began. One officer wrote down her information as best he could from what little she said. When asked for her ID again, she explained it was in her car and gave them her license plate number. Another officer went to verify. While she waited, she stayed quiet, sitting in the small holding area near the desk. The station wasn't unfamiliar. She'd been there many times for briefings and reports. But sitting on that side of the counter made her chest tighten. The officer who went to check her car returned about 10 minutes later. He had her badge in his hand. His face looked puzzled. She wasn't lying," he said to his partner. "She's one of ours. Detective Division." A silence filled the room. The officer doing the paperwork froze mid-sentence. Everyone turned toward her, realization slowly settling in. The younger officer who had brought her in swallowed hard. "Wait, are you—" She nodded slightly, still calm but visibly shaken. "Yes, off duty, I told you that." No one spoke for a moment. The room felt heavy, the weight of embarrassment and guilt hanging in the air. One of the senior officers stepped forward, clearly trying to smooth things over. "There must have been a mistake." "Let's clear this up," he said gently. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She simply looked at them and said, "I understand you were just doing your job, but I wish someone had listened." That sentence stayed with them. As the officers reviewed the security footage, it became clear she hadn't intended to leave without paying. The timestamp showed she had answered a call, turned toward the door while still on the phone, and hadn't made it to the checkout. Everything matched what she had said. The senior officer offered an apology, his tone sincere. "We should have checked first. This shouldn't have happened." She nodded, still quiet. She wasn't angry anymore, just tired. "Next time, give people a chance to speak," she said softly. The rest of the evening passed in an awkward calm. The store was contacted, reports were adjusted, and she was officially cleared. But even though her name was clean, the feeling of being treated like a suspect lingered. It was something she wouldn't forget easily. When she finally walked out of the station, the sun had already set. The city lights flickered on one by one, and the streets looked different somehow. Colder, maybe. She stood for a moment near her car, breathing in the night air. She thought about the officers inside, how nervous they looked once they realized their mistake. She knew they hadn't meant harm, but she also knew something needed to change. Driving home, she kept replaying the day in her mind, how something so small could spiral into something so humiliating. It could have been anyone in her place. She just happened to wear the same badge as those who arrested her. She turned on the radio, hoping the music would clear her thoughts. But the noise only made the silence in her heart louder. Still, she reminded herself of the one thing her years on the force had taught her. Every mistake carries a lesson. That night, as she finally sat at her kitchen table with the small bag of items she had gone to buy, she realized how quickly judgment can replace understanding, even among those trained to know better. And though she didn't know it yet, the incident that had started with a simple misunderstanding at a store would soon become a moment that made her department rethink the way it handled truth, trust, and the people it swore to protect when including its own. The next morning started quietly, but the calm didn't last long. By the time she walked into her precinct, whispers had already spread. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with concern. She could feel the tension even before anyone said a word. One of her close colleagues approached her near the coffee machine. "Hey, are you okay? I heard something happened yesterday." She gave a small nod, trying to act casual. "Yeah, just a misunderstanding. It's all cleared now." But misunderstandings like that didn't stay quiet for long. By noon, everyone in the building seemed to know that an off-duty officer had been detained for shoplifting, even if most of them didn't yet know it was her. The few who did kept stealing glances her way, unsure whether to bring it up or stay silent. She tried to focus on her reports, typing slowly, but her mind kept replaying yesterday's events. The sound of the guard's voice calling out to her, the flashing store lights, the clicking of handcuffs. It all lingered like an echo she couldn't shake off. She had always believed that the uniform protected her from those moments of public doubt. Yesterday showed her that even officers could be stripped of that shield in a single instant. Later that afternoon, her supervisor called her into his office. He was an older man with tired eyes, someone she respected deeply. He motioned for her to sit, and his voice was calm. "I got the report," he said, "and I want to hear from you directly. What exactly happened?" She took a deep breath and told him everything. How she was shopping, how she got the call, how she intended to pay afterward, and how quickly things escalated. She didn't dramatize it or add emotion. She just stated the facts as they were. When she finished, he stayed silent for a long time, looking at her with a mix of concern and disappointment. Not in her, but in how things were handled. "This shouldn't have happened," he finally said. "You've been serving for years. They should have verified before taking action. I'll be filing a report myself, but you need to be prepared, and the press might get wind of this. And if they do, they'll twist it however they want." Her stomach dropped a little. "I understand," she said quietly. He leaned forward, his tone softening. "I know you. You've always done your job with integrity. Don't let this break that spirit. Let's handle it carefully." She nodded, grateful for his support, though her heart still felt heavy. She had always been strong in every emergency, every tense moment. But this was different. This wasn't about danger. This was about dignity. That evening, as she drove home, she noticed something she hadn't before. How easy it was for people to make quick judgments. She saw a man arguing with a parking officer on the street, and for a second she could sense both sides. The officer trying to follow procedure, and the man feeling wronged. She had been in both positions now. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from one of the officers who had detained her the day before. It read simply, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. We didn't know." She stared at the message for a moment, unsure how to respond. A part of her wanted to ignore it, but another part remembered the look on their faces when they realized their mistake. They had been just as shaken as she was. After a pause, she typed back, "It's okay. Just be careful next time. Listen first." The reply came back almost instantly. "We will." The following days were a blur of mixed feelings. Her colleagues treated her kindly, but she could sense the unspoken awkwardness in the air. Some avoided eye contact. Others overcompensated with friendliness. It was as if no one knew how to act around her anymore. She didn't blame them. She was still figuring out how to act around herself. A week later, an internal review was opened about the incident. Not against her, but about the handling of the situation by the responding officers and the store's coordination with law enforcement. She was asked to give her statement in writing. She sat at her desk late into the evening trying to find the right words. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want anyone punished. She just wanted acknowledgement. That things like this could be avoided if people slowed down, verified facts, and treated others with a bit more patience. When she finished writing, her statement wasn't long or emotional. It was simple and clear. Mistakes happen. But as officers, we must remember that our duty is not only to enforce the law, but also to protect dignity, including the dignity of those we might misunderstand. A few days later, the review meeting took place. The officers who had detained her were there, sitting quietly on one side of the room. Their expressions showed a mix of discomfort and regret. The store manager attended too, explaining how the confusion started with a security guard's call. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up calmly and faced them all. "I know no one meant harm," she began, "but this could have gone very differently. Imagine if I had reacted defensively, or if I had raised my voice. It could have escalated fast. I've seen innocent people lose their temper when they're scared, and it never ends well. That's why I'm saying this. Before making judgments, we need to take a breath. Ask questions, verify. Not everything is as it seems." The room stayed quiet. Her words weren't angry. They were heavy with honesty. The senior officer leading the meeting nodded. "You're right," he said. "We've already decided to include a refresher on verification and de-escalation in our upcoming training. And this incident will be used as a case example. Anonymously, of course. She gave a small nod. That's all I wanted. When the meeting ended, one of the younger officers, the same one who had guided her into the patrol car that day, came up to her. His voice was soft. I still feel terrible about what happened, he said. You were calm the whole time. Most people wouldn't have been. She looked at him for a moment before answering. That's because I understood why you acted the way you did. But understanding doesn't mean it didn't hurt. He nodded, looking down. It won't happen again. I hope not, she said, and left it at that. Over the next few weeks, the story began to settle. It never made it to the press, thankfully. But within the department, it became a quiet lesson everyone remembered. People started talking more about how easily perception could cloud judgment. How sometimes doing things by the book wasn't enough if compassion was missing between the lines. One morning, while reviewing reports in the break room, she overheard two rookies talking about the case. They didn't know she was behind them. One said, "Can you believe they almost arrested one of our own?" "That's wild." The other replied, "Yeah, but it makes sense. If you don't double-check, anyone can make that kind of mistake." She didn't turn around or interrupt. She just smiled slightly. That was exactly what she had hoped, that others would learn something meaningful from it. Life slowly returned to normal, though something inside her had shifted. She started noticing little things she hadn't before. The tired expressions of suspects she interviewed, the nervousness in people's eyes when they were questioned. It made her softer, more patient. She still did her job with the same dedication, but now she approached people with more humanity. One evening, a few months later, she stopped by the same store again. She hadn't been back since the incident. The shelves looked the same, the aisles familiar. She picked up a few items and walked to the register. The cashier, a young woman who had been working there the day it all happened, recognized her immediately. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry about that day," the cashier said quietly. "It didn't feel right, but we didn't know what to do." She smiled kindly. "It's all right. You were just following instructions. Let's just say we all learned something that day." The cashier nodded, relieved. "I'm glad you came back." As she walked out with her bag of paid items, she paused for a moment at the exit. The same place where everything had gone wrong before. The same glass doors, the same bright lights. But this time she walked out freely, her head held high, her heart lighter. When she got to her car, she sat for a while, looking out at the parking lot. Life had a strange way of teaching lessons, she thought. Sometimes the moments that humiliate you the most end up making you wiser. She knew the incident would never fully leave her memory, but she also knew it had given her something valuable: empathy. And that, she realized, was the one thing every good officer needed most. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, she started her car, took a deep breath, and drove away, stronger than before, quietly grateful that a painful experience had turned into a lesson worth sharing. Weeks had turned into months since the mix-up at the store, and life had mostly settled back into its usual rhythm. The days felt normal again, or at least they looked that way from the outside. Inside, though, she still carried the quiet weight of what had happened. Each morning she would get up, put on her uniform, and look at herself in the mirror for a few extra seconds. It wasn't vanity, it was reflection. Every time she clipped her badge onto her belt, she remembered how that same badge sitting in her car had almost cost her reputation. It reminded her how fragile trust could be, how easily it could crack under pressure and misunderstanding. Her work performance hadn't changed. She was still dedicated, still careful, still respected by her peers. But there was something different in her tone, in the way she spoke to people. She had become more patient, more understanding. She listened longer before deciding what to do. Even the people she questioned or arrested seemed to notice. One day, during a community outreach event at a local school, she was asked to speak about police work. Standing in front of a group of teenagers, she began with a story, not about bravery or crime, but about mistakes and lessons. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people think being a police officer means you're always right, that you never get misunderstood. But that's not true. We're human too. We make mistakes. Sometimes we're the ones who get misunderstood." The students listened closely. She didn't tell them the full story, but she described how assumptions could hurt people, even the ones wearing the badge. She told them that respect had to go both ways, from citizens to police, and from police to citizens. When the talk ended, A student came up and asked, "Have you ever been treated unfairly, even though you were innocent?" She smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "and it taught me more than any training ever could." The question stayed with her all day. It reminded her that what had happened wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was an example of how fragile justice could be when people stop seeing each other as human beings. Back at the station, she noticed changes starting to happen. Small but meaningful. Officers began double-checking identification more carefully. They took a little more time before jumping to conclusions during calls. Her supervisor had introduced a new briefing topic every Monday called Pause and Verify, inspired by her experience, though no one mentioned her name directly. One afternoon, she received a call from the training division asking if she could assist in developing a short internal video about officer conduct and verification. At first, she hesitated. The thought of revisiting that painful memory made her uneasy. But then she realized this might be her chance to turn something bad into something meaningful. She agreed. The following week, she found herself in front of a small camera setup inside the station's training room. There was no script, no fancy lighting, just her, a chair, and a quiet space. The instructor asked her to share her thoughts on why verifying identity and intent mattered in police work. She took a deep breath before speaking. "When we put on this uniform, we represent trust," she began. "People expect us to be fair, to listen, and to make the right decisions. But even we can forget that sometimes. It's easy to see a situation, make a quick call, and act fast, especially under pressure. But what we often forget is that every second we save by rushing might cost someone their dignity." She paused, her eyes steady. "I learned that the hard way, not because I made a mistake, but because I became someone else's mistake. And I don't hold it against them. I just hope none of us ever forget that behind every call, behind every accusation, there's a person. And they deserve to be heard before they're judged." The room stayed silent for a long moment after she finished. The instructor quietly said, "That was perfect," and turned off the camera. Weeks later, the video was shown during a department-wide training session. Officers from different precincts watched her calm, sincere message. Many didn't know it was her story, but it struck a chord with everyone who listened. The response was powerful. Officers began discussing how easy it was to misread a situation, how a few extra seconds of listening or verifying could change an outcome completely. Some shared their own stories of misunderstandings on duty. For the first time in a long while, conversations around empathy and patience replaced the usual talk about arrests and paperwork. Her life slowly started to feel lighter. The weight she'd been carrying began to fade, replaced with quiet pride. Still, there were moments when memories resurfaced. Flashes of embarrassment, the sound of people whispering, the click of the patrol car door closing behind her. But instead of anger, she now felt understanding. One evening, as she walked to her car after a long shift, she noticed the same young officer who had been part of her mistaken detention months earlier. He was standing by his patrol car, looking uneasy after a tense call. She walked over. "Rough day?" she asked. He sighed. "Yeah, we got a call about a man acting suspicious near a store. Turns out he was just waiting for a ride. I almost called it in as a possible theft, but I remembered what happened before. I stopped, talked to him first. It turned out fine." She nodded, a small smile forming. "That's how you learn. Not from books, but from moments like that." He looked relieved. "I thought you might still be upset with me." "I was never angry," she said gently. "Just disappointed in how easily people can forget to listen. But it looks like you remembered." They both smiled, and in that quiet parking lot, something settled between them. Not just forgiveness, but respect. That night, as she drove home, she passed the department store again. The lights were glowing, the same automatic doors sliding open for late-night shoppers. She thought about how a single misunderstanding in that place had started a ripple effect that changed so many things. Not just for her, but for everyone around her. She decided to stop inside not because she needed anything, but because she wanted to close that chapter for good. Walking through the aisles, she saw familiar shelves and the same soft music playing overhead. It felt strange, like stepping into a memory. But this time she felt calm. The cashier from before waved at her, surprised but happy to see her again. "Hey, it's nice to see you again," the cashier said. "How have you been?" "Doing all right," she replied with a warm smile. "Better, actually." She picked up a small notebook near the counter, plain with a blue cover, and paid for it. As she walked out, she paused at the exit, looking back at the store one last time. In that moment, she realized something powerful. Forgiveness wasn't about pretending something never happened. It was about taking control of the story afterward. She had turned an embarrassing mistake into a message that helped others think twice, act slower, and judge less. When she got home, she opened the new notebook and began writing. Not a report, not an official statement, just her thoughts. She wrote about patience, about humility, about how easily people could lose sight of each other's humanity. She didn't plan to publish it or share it publicly. It was just for her, a way to remind herself that strength wasn't always about standing tall, but about staying kind when you had every reason not to be. Over time, she found herself mentoring younger officers more often. She didn't lecture them about rules or procedures. She talked about people, about how every case involved more than what appeared on paper. When rookies got frustrated with slow progress or difficult civilians, she told them, "You don't know what kind of day they've had. Patience might be the one thing that keeps a bad situation from turning worse." Her words carried weight because they came from experience. The same mistake that once made her feel small had now made her wiser. Months later, during an award ceremony for community service, her supervisor surprised her by mentioning her contribution to the training program. He didn't describe the details, but he said, "Sometimes, the best lessons in this job come from humility, from officers who turn their own hardships into guidance for others." As people clapped, she felt her throat tighten. It wasn't about recognition. It was about closure. That night, as she drove home, she looked at the badge resting on her dashboard. It glimmered faintly under the passing streetlights. She smiled to herself, whispering, "Maybe that day wasn't the worst thing that happened to me after all." And deep down, she knew it was true. What had begun as humiliation had become healing. What had started as a mistake had turned into a lesson, not just for her, but for everyone who wore the same badge. Time had passed, and life in the department was moving forward. But the echo of that one misunderstanding still shaped quiet conversations in the hallways. It wasn't something anyone talked about openly, but it lived in people's minds as a lesson. The training program inspired by her experience had become a regular part of the academy's sessions, and new recruits often left those classes thinking differently about what it meant to wear a uniform. She didn't talk about it much anymore. It wasn't something she wanted to relive, but it wasn't something she was ashamed of either. It had changed her in ways she didn't expect. The incident had stripped away pride but replaced it with something stronger: empathy. One afternoon, she was sitting in her car after a long shift. The sun was dipping low, turning the city streets gold. She had just finished responding to a minor traffic incident. Nothing major, just a small misunderstanding between two drivers. But the way one of them reacted reminded her of herself months ago, confused, frustrated, feeling unfairly judged. As she sat quietly, she realized something. Maybe what happened to her wasn't just about her. Maybe it was meant to open her eyes so she could see what others felt when they stood in that same position. Maybe it was a chance to see policing from the other side, not from authority but from vulnerability. That evening, she received a message from an officer in another district. He had seen her training video and wanted to talk. He said he had recently dealt with a similar situation. He had stopped someone he thought was stealing, but it turned out to be a misunderstanding. He wrote, "I remembered your words and took a second to ask before acting. Turned out the man was just confused. You saved me from making a mistake I'd regret." She read that message twice, smiling quietly to herself. It made her feel that what she went through had purpose. The pain, the embarrassment, the long nights thinking about what went wrong, it had all turned into something that helped others. Still, there were moments she found herself thinking about that day in the store. Sometimes, when she walked through similar aisles, her body tensed slightly, remembering how it felt to be watched and misunderstood. But those memories no longer brought shame. Instead, they reminded her that no one, not even those who enforce the law, is immune to being judged wrongly. A few months later, she was invited to speak at a community event organized by the city. It was about rebuilding trust between police officers and citizens, something that had become more important than ever. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but the organizers insisted that her experience had made a difference in how the department operated. The event took place in a small auditorium filled with families, local business owners, and community leaders. When she stepped onto the stage, the lights were soft and the crowd was quiet, waiting for her to begin. "I never imagined I'd be here talking about something like this," she started. "I've worn this uniform for many years, and I've always believed that being an officer means standing for fairness. But a while back, I learned that fairness isn't just something we give to others. It's something we have to remember to give to ourselves and to each other." She paused for a moment, scanning the crowd. Faces looked back at her with curiosity, empathy, and understanding. "A mistake was made," she continued, "one that could have easily been avoided if just a few extra seconds were taken to listen, to verify, to understand. I was mistaken for someone I wasn't, and for a moment I felt what it was like to lose my voice. That feeling of being powerless, misunderstood, judged, it changes you. It teaches you to see people differently." The room was silent except for her voice. "Since that day, I've made it my mission to remind everyone, officers and citizens alike, that assumptions can ruin lives, but understanding can save them." When she finished, people stood and clapped. Some even walked up to her afterward to share their own stories of being misjudged or treated unfairly. It was overwhelming but healing at the same time. For the first time since the incident, she felt that her story wasn't a source of embarrassment but of connection. Later that night, as she sat alone in her kitchen, she thought about how far she had come. The walls were quiet, the sound of the clock soft in the background. She thought about the officers who had detained her, the ones who later apologized. She hadn't seen them in a while, but she often wondered how they were doing. If they had forgiven themselves the same way she had forgiven them, she hoped they had. The next morning at work, her supervisor called her into his office again. He looked proud. "I heard about the event last night," he said with a smile. "You did good. You've turned a rough experience into something that's making real change. The department's been getting positive feedback from the community." She nodded, smiling modestly. "I'm just glad it's helping." "It's more than helping," he said. "You've set an example, not just as an officer but as a person." Those words stayed with her long after she left his office. She didn't need medals or certificates. Those meant little compared to the quiet respect she had earned. One afternoon a few weeks later, she got an unexpected visit at the station. It was the younger officer, the one who had first detained her that day. He looked nervous but determined. "Hey," he said softly. "Do you have a minute?" She gestured for him to sit. "I just wanted to thank you," he said. "Not just for forgiving me, but for everything you've done since then. That mistake, it changed me. I'm more careful now. I take time to listen, and I talk about what happened with new recruits so they don't forget." She smiled warmly. "That means more than you know." He looked down for a moment, then added, "I also wanted to tell you my sister works at that same store. She told me they've started a training program for their staff too, about handling customers more respectfully and avoiding assumptions. Guess you started something bigger than you realize." She laughed softly. "Maybe. I just wanted people to learn." When he left, she sat there quietly, feeling a sense of peace. It was strange how life worked. A moment that once made her feel powerless had now empowered so many others. It was proof that even painful experiences could grow into something beautiful, if handled with honesty and grace. As the months rolled on, the story began to fade from daily conversation, but its lessons lived on. Officers acted differently. The community spoke to them with more trust. It wasn't perfect. Misunderstandings still happened, but there was a visible effort to be better. She had started writing again in her blue notebook, not about anger or sadness, but about growth. Small stories she noticed each day that reminded her of the good still left in people. She wrote about the kindness of strangers, the patience of a young officer helping a nervous witness, the apology from a man who had shouted at her during an arrest. All those moments became part of her quiet healing. One weekend, she decided to visit her parents out of town. They lived in a small, peaceful neighborhood far from the city noise. Sitting with them in the garden, sipping tea, she told them about everything that had happened, from the mistake to the speech to the changes that followed. Her father, who had always been proud but strict, listened quietly. When she finished, he smiled gently and said, "Sometimes life puts you through fire not to burn you, but to show others that they can walk through it too." She nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. It sure felt like fire at first. He chuckled softly. But look at you now, stronger than before. As she drove back to the city later that evening, the word stayed in her heart. Stronger than before. It felt true. She no longer saw that day in the store as her worst memory. Instead, it had become a symbol of resilience, a turning point that taught her to look beyond what's visible and to give people the grace of being heard. Before going to bed that night, she flipped open her notebook and wrote one last line before closing it. I learned that even when you're misunderstood, staying calm and true to yourself can turn the story around. Sometimes the best way to fix a mistake is not with anger but with understanding. She smiled to herself, closed the book, and turned off the light. The city outside was quiet, peaceful. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this wasn't just the end of a difficult chapter. It was the beginning of something much better. And though no one else could see it, that one misunderstanding had quietly built a bridge between the badge and the people, between judgment and empathy, between what she once was and who she had become. Months had passed since the incident at the store, and life had begun to feel more normal, though the memory of that day never completely disappeared. The woman, now back in her full rhythm of work, community events, and training programs, often reflected quietly on how much she had learned about herself and others. Each day, she carried a new awareness with her. Every person she encountered was a story, a life she didn't fully understand at first glance. She saw this in her work more clearly now. People who came to the station with complaints, neighbors asking for help, even suspects in minor cases. They all had their own fears, their own confusion, and she understood that rushing to judgment could make everything worse. One afternoon, she received a call about a small disturbance at a local shop. A man had been accused of taking merchandise without paying. When she arrived, she noticed the tension in the air. The store employee was anxious, the man looked defensive, and the surrounding shoppers were curious. She stepped in slowly, hands relaxed at her sides. "Hi there," she said calmly. "I'm here to understand what's going on." She spoke with everyone involved before taking any action, asking questions gently and listening carefully. In a matter of minutes, she discovered it was a misunderstanding. The man had picked up the wrong item and didn't realize it. No one had been dishonest. No one had intended harm. She resolved the situation quickly, ensuring the man left the store with dignity intact. As she walked back to her car, she thought about the difference one calm approach could make. Had she not learned to pause, to verify, to listen before acting, this situation could have escalated just like the one months ago at the department store. She felt quietly satisfied that the lessons of her own mistake were making a real difference in the lives of others. That evening, she received a message from a young officer who had been part of her department's Pause and Verify training sessions. "I used your advice today. I stopped, asked questions, and avoided a mistake." "Thank you." She smiled, touched by the simplicity of the message. It was a small moment, but it reminded her that change could ripple quietly, far beyond what she could see. The message wasn't about her glory or recognition. It was about influence and impact. Life outside the department also reflected her growth. She spent weekends volunteering at a local youth center, speaking to teens about responsibility, integrity, and the importance of understanding others. Her stories weren't about glory or punishment. They were about real experiences, about mistakes, and about the ways people could learn and grow from them. One afternoon, a teen asked her a question that made her pause. "Have you ever been treated unfairly?" he asked, his voice honest and curious. She smiled softly. "Yes," she said. "And it taught me something very important, that even people who wear a badge can be misunderstood. And that's why we should always try to understand each other before making decisions." The teens listened, captivated by the sincerity in her voice. She wasn't telling them what they wanted to hear. She was telling them the truth.